The following is a Shaw TV Public Affairs presentation.
Over the past 16 years, Rich Coleman has carved out quite a reputation as the fixer in cabinet. When Premier Gordon Campbell or Premier Christy Clark had a problem file, it often ended up on Rich Coleman's desk to fix. Well, now he's doing the ultimate fixing job, trying to fix the BC Liberals as they navigate the transition into opposition.
Good evening and welcome to Voice of BC. I'm Vaughn Palmer and we're well into the fall session of the legislature under a brand new government, and the leader of the opposition is here with us tonight. Rich Coleman, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. So you decided not to go for the leadership yourself.
Yep.
And what do you figure is your job between now and February the 3rd when the party picks the new leader?
Well, the job started out with basically hiring staff, getting organized, figuring out critic roles, training people on all aspects of whether it be research, communication, even legislative assistance. There weren't any. You had to just basically start from scratch and get all the offices set up, and then have the members come in for some time at the end of August to start getting used to their roles, because some of these folks were new. So this was all new to them from the standpoint of what their job were. There were others who had been here for up to 15 years or 16 years or more that were now adjusting to the fact that never known opposition. So you had to sort of change the mindset a little bit and get them ready and comfortable with their jobs. And I really thought that probably after about 3-4 weeks of session, they'd start to hit their stride. But I was very impressed. I thought they hit their stride the first week, and they're doing a good job.
Your predecessor left you in the lurch a bit?
No, I think we were actually ready to go transition, I think, but what happened when my predecessor left, some of the senior people that also left with severance, so I had to find a chief of staff and a head of communication, those type of people. But it wasn't hard because I knew a lot of people, and I basically attracted back some folks that I had a lot of trust in and a lot of confidence in. They're doing a great job.
You were caught by surprise when one of your members of caucus suddenly showed up in the speaker's chair in the House.
I was.
You gotten over that yet?
I've gotten over my initial anger, but I would never trust the individual again. Somebody that lies to your face 3 times and lies to caucus's face directly.
This is Darryl Plecas, the
Yes,
speaker,
yeah.
right?
At least twice that he came into caucus and said he would never do this. You have to say, well, I've lost a lot of confidence in the individual. I mean, I will always respect the chair, but I won't respect the person in the chair.
Well, I know I sit right above you in the House, and one of the things I've noticed, particularly with you, is you ask the questions through the speaker.
Yeah.
But you're not looking at the speaker when you do it. You're often looking down. You don't make a lot of eye contact with the guy.
No, I don't. I actually don't. And I think it's probably just as well. But if you recall, if you've watched me in the House over the years, I often didn't look at the speaker when I was answering questions, because my friend Bill Barazoff, who was speaker for years, and then Linda Reid, and prior to that, when I was a minister over the years, I always found if I want to string it out just a little bit more and get my point across, the last thing you wanted to do was look over at the speaker, who would be saying to a member they might be going to have you sit down. So I always thought if you look down towards the other piece of the audience, it might work a little better.
I want to ask you about a couple of issues that the opposition raised in the House this week, because there's been a lot of media coverage of it, both stories. So let's start off with the ride-sharing thing first, Uber and Lyft, and the issue as you see it.
Well, the issue as I see it is, the government would like to say you should have done this, but now you're the government. We didn't make the promise that by the end of 2017 there would be ride-sharing in British Columbia. The NDP did that on their platform. So the issue is you're breaking a promise, and now you're going to go out and hire the same consultant that wrote a report for Vancouver, who really is more of a taxi person than a ride-sharing person, to write another report at a cost of $165,000. And then it sounds like, according to even the interviews done with the author that's going to be working on this, or they'll go back out for some more consultations. So now it's 2018, probably the end of 2018. And it isn't really that complicated anymore. I think a lot of the work was done as to what the issues were with the taxi industry and with how you'd license it, and the criminal record checks and things were being done. And so really it's about the breaking of the promise, which is just one more, frankly.
Their partner in government, Andrew Weaver, got up in the legislature today and tabled a bill that would do just this. It's similar to one he's done before. He says he doesn't really understand why the government won't do this. The bill's right there. I assume the Liberals would be prepared to vote for it? But it's up to the government to call it for debate, right?
Yeah, it's a private member's bill, so it can be referred to a standing committee of private members' bills and those type of things, And it could go. They could go take it to Legislative Council and rewrite it in a way that would stand up to the approval of the Legislative Council of the government. The challenge with, Andrew's bill, as it is I read it today. It's missing some things, I think, on the level playing field. But if we could get the adjustments that would make it fair to the taxi industry, level the playing field on things like the cost of insurance and what insurance people are going to be using if they're going to be driving a rideshare, which is really important because when we were looking at this, the first thing we understood from ICBC, so if somebody gets a business insurance and they decide to go, drive an Uber, that they wouldn't cover that because that is not considered to be part of the business insurance. That's in another area of insurance for where you're being paid for fare. So that comes under the transportation authorities. And so if you don't have the right insurance and then there's an accident, the person that gets injured, if they're the passenger, wouldn't get covered by the insurance corporation because they could void the insurance because it doesn't have the proper insurance. So he has some language in and around there on that. The criminal record check part is there. The same driver's licenses for both parties. I think there's some work that needs to be done there. But the level playing field, which we were trying to accomplish, including upgrading, because of the number of accidents taxis can be, and we're actually going to we were going to upgrade some of the crash stuff with regards to the cars, so they'd have, the driver would get crash warnings if they're driving a cab, which would reduce the number of accidents. It obviously saves money, so ICBC was prepared to step up and do some of that. And then we were also going to provide them with somebody so they could upgrade their own app to be competitive. And I think we got to a pretty good place with the industry, although, some of the taxi industry would just say don't ever have ride sharing. But the reality is at some point in time, these two are going to collide. I don't think that it needs to be a collision that's not fair to anybody. And if Andrew Weaver wanted to sit down and figure out what would go in the bill, or if it ever hit the floor, we would put up amendments and work with us on it. We might just support it.
I've seen some comment from Greens who the party, they're new to having their party have a partner in government. It's a new thing for British Columbia. But some surprise that they thought there was going to be more of both Weaver and Horgan at the beginning said, well, the parties are going to work together and we're going to try to put things together. And yet on this one, it looks as if you've got the Liberals and the Greens at least ready to work on a bill, and the New Democrats want no part of it.
That's correct. They want to drag it out. They want to do more consultation. I really do think that they're at a place where they don't want to have any confrontation with the taxi industry. And the reality is that they made this commitment. We didn't make it for them. They made it for themselves. They put it in their platform, and now they're being criticized because they're not following through on it.
The other one I wanted to ask you about, to get your take on, is this letter that surfaced at the beginning of the week from the Agriculture Minister to one of the big fish farming companies on the coast, where she seems to be threatening them that the government is going to not renew their leases, their tenures to operate those fish farms when they expire next June.
Well, it's really not so much the issue of the renewal. There's a process for that. You go through an application process. Well, when you get a letter ahead of time that prejudges what might do, or actually it was pretty in the language, I would say it would never have gone out of my office as a minister or any other minister with that type of threatening language to a particular company that I'm watching you. We're basically threatening that we're going to take away your opportunity to operate. And this is the problem here is these are incremental things that send investment away from British Columbia. So we're not going to honor the tenure here. We're going to threaten you about it in a letter, and a letter that should never have gone out from a minister. But prior to that, we also have the situations where other things have gone out, like in the spring of 2016, the now Premier and the now Environment Minister wrote to the federal government to try and start the permitting process for Pacific Northwest LNG. So when they decided to look at their final investment decision this spring, I sat down with the CEOs after they made the decision. They said, well, one of the things we were very concerned about was you now have a Premier who wants to stop the project. We need a permit, or we're going to, it'll cost us $2 billion more if it delays. So we had to sit there as organizations and say, maybe not now. And then they also brought up the fact that quite frankly, they said, and your permitting process in Asia, so it'd be Japan, Korea, China, and other countries, is not seen to be worth anything in Canada, because you have a permit, not a project we're involved, but you have a permit on a pipeline issued by your federal government to go ahead, and you have the provincial governments trying to stop the project. So where is the certainty around what we're allowed to do and invest in as business in your province? And until you sort that out, and I've been told very clearly, and I've been told this by some senior bankers too, until you sort that out, a lot of money is going to sit in the sidelines relative to investment in British Columbia.
There's a report on the Ministry of Forest Lands and Natural Resources on Crown land tenures. It was done in 2010. That's the most recent one I can find. And these leases for the fish farms are essentially a 5-year right to operate a fish farm above the ocean bottom. So you're floating there. You're also regulated by federal, but the provincial lease is the ocean bottom. But the report's fascinating. There's 60,000 of these tenures of one kind or another on Crown land in British Columbia. They range from, you can run a mine, a drilling rights for an oil and gas well, forest, timber cutting, but they also go down to stuff like mom and pop operations. Summer cottages on Crown land are on a tenure system. And one of the things the minister suggested in her ministry, in her letter, is that because the government has now adopted the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Persons, this changes the obligations on tenure holders all across British Columbia, all 60,000 of them.
Well, it can. I think that the acronym is, we refer to as UNDRIP, right? But
yes,
it's really, but it is what it is you talk to First Nations and they'll tell you, First Nations community I've been dealing with for years, even after this government said that they were going to adopt it, said, well, it means nothing to us. The United Nations has no jurisdiction over our lands. We have a process in place, whether it be treaty process or whether it's business deals we're making. You know, someone like the Tsawwassen First Nation who are doing 99-year leases for housing, or the other ones are going about their business, and that piece for them is not in the sort of like their mind is something that's going to control what they do or do not do. But by doing that, you send this certain uncertainty. And you're right about small business. This is the guy who, in Headley, has a number of acres of land, of Crown land, that he has range for his cattle on. This is somebody that has a cottage. This is someone that has a tourism operation, whether it be a guide outfitter or even a nature type, a photo, like an environmental thing, tenure where you can go take people into an area and you can do tours with them. This affects all of that, and there is no legal decision or thing that says UNDRIP has to be it. I mean, we do have a pretty successful, a lot of work that's been done on tenures with First Nations, working on them with whether it be forest and range agreements, whether it be tenures and revenue sharing agreements and all that stuff. That should continue to allow First Nations to get on with doing what they want to do, and that's to create opportunities for their people and jobs for their people. And they want to do it in cooperation with the rest of the private sector, because obviously they have to partner up.
There will be many more things to talk about tonight, and we've got a bunch of guests who ask questions on tape for Rich Coleman. So let us start with, you already seen him off the top, but here he goes, Jordan Bateman.
Rich, obviously the BC Liberals are in a leadership race, and a big emerging theme of that race is what went wrong in the last election. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. What do you think happened that prevented the BC Liberals from securing that 5th majority?
Well, there's never been a perfect campaign, I don't think, ever run. I've never seen one, and I've ran them.
I don't think this year's would make the top 10.
Maybe not, but if you look at it, what went wrong, depending on which portion of the campaign you're looking at. The Conservative...
Well, how about the ending, where you lost your majority?
Well, we didn't like that very much, obviously.
So what went wrong?
Well, in two places, a Conservative vote actually took enough votes away from us on the split. That would be in Comox and Maple Ridge Mission. The toll piece in the area of Surrey, by taking the tolls off the bridges, actually gave them a bump in the polls. And maybe we were thinking too much like a government and thinking you got to do things right fiscally and what have you. And let's just not go out there that far. That's why we went with a $500 max, because we're still concerned about the debt to GDP. And little things like that, other things where I think the NDP did a very good job of really beating down the Premier's image through their advertising and how they went about it. Not so dissimilar to how they did it with Gordon Campbell back in 1996. It was a very similar playbook, I think, in these two campaigns. And I think you have to recognize it as you come through it. You accept your result. Mm-hmm. You take a look how you can do stuff in the future. And I don't like looking way back. Like I told the party presidents, what have you, at a meeting a few weeks ago, it's time to look forward. You accept the results. This was very close. Obviously, everybody knows that, 43, 41, and 3. And so you have to now decide how you're going to reboot, reorganize, and get on with it, because there's no sense in looking backward all the time. It accomplishes nothing. You need to figure out how you can do better, get on with your leadership campaign, find the new leader, and then move the party forward.
One other thing, I spoke to a group of political science students and professors in Victoria this week, and I just mentioned one number. If 200 people more, roughly 200 people more, had voted for the Liberals in one riding, Coleman-Courtney, Christy Clark would still be Premier of British Columbia. Anybody ever tells you your vote doesn't count, if anybody ever tells you it doesn't matter if you vote, we've had some incredibly close elections in British Columbia, and this one will go into the record book, I guess, as the closest.
But they've always been close.
Oh,
If you look
at,
at 96. Somebody was upset. They said, "Well, you won the most votes and you won the most seats, but you're not the government." And I said, "Look, the history in politics in BC is really, if there's a split on one side or the other, one party will win." And 96, as you remember, the BC Liberals got the most votes,
but the fewest seats.
They got the fewest, not the most seats. So because there was a split in certain ridings, so. Some of it's just about the math, and some of it's about the campaign. But at the end of the day, if you get enough of a movement one way or direction, you can really see a slip. And the one I saw the most, because I was running a campaign for the Socreds back in 1991, when the Gordon Wilson campaign came trundling up the Fraser Valley. Gary Farrell Collins is his name then, Gary Collins today, probably spent $1,500 on a campaign against a very well-oiled and well-funded machine and beat the incumbent. Yeah. And that was just a wave of movement. So it's pretty unpredictable stuff.
That election, we always tell the story of the Liberal winner who got a phone call from his Socred opponent congratulating him on election night, and he refused to believe that he'd won because he'd gone to bed. He couldn't imagine he would win. And there was one candidate in that campaign that spent $85 and won a seat in the House. So
one of them had the media knocking on the door in the morning. And I said, "What are you here for?
You're the new MLA.
You're elected."
Okay, here's a good question. This one arises out of some incredible coverage by a reporter in Vancouver who works for Post Media, Sam Cooper, on gambling. Question about it all, however. Maureen Karagianis, the former NDP MLA. Here she is.
In 2010, when you were the minister responsible for gaming, you defended dismantling the RCMP investigation into illegal activities in casinos. Now, of course, we have a huge revelation about a report that the BC Liberals ignored on money laundering. How do you defend any of that now?
Well, first of all, we didn't disband. What we did is we integrated. And it was a move that was recommended by senior management within policing agencies across the province, that we integrate the investigation piece with regards to money laundering and not just focus it strictly on casinos, but to build it into the organized crime group that were trained officers and whatever, integrate that. The investigative branch of the Gaming Policy Enforcement Branch at that time continued and still continues today, and didn't have its funding cut.
What about this report that David Evie put it out? He says you guys basically sat on it. He put it out, and it's a pretty damning report.
I don't think we sat on it. Obviously I wasn't involved in the report, but I think that in my feeling is, knowing the Lottery Corporation, knowing the operators, knowing this particular industry, and knowing that there are places where people try and target to launder money in our society. Sometimes it's through the liquor and bar system, and they used to call it money laundering through old dry cleaning operations years ago. That you have to stay vigilant on it. We increased how we did things at different times. We moved to where we wouldn't give a cash payout at a certain level. If somebody brought in cash, we would actually issue a check so that we could have a paper trail to follow the money. So FinTrack, the financial people that track money, could do that along with the police. And some of the stuff in the report, I I wasn't comfortable or uncomfortable with it from the standpoint of like, okay, we always known that we've got to stay on top of this. We'll continue to stay on top of it. And it's always easy to pick out a piece of a file, but not look at the total package, which frankly, the increase in security and investigation and ability to track is very much improved in the last decade with regards to money laundering.
We will take a brief break on the show, and we'll be right back with Rich Coleman. Stay with us. How you doing?
I recently had some very severe health issues, and it was touching when people like Rich Coleman, Michelle Stilwell, and even Premier John Horgan reached out and offered me encouragement and kind words. It's a good reminder that the politicians we see on Voice of BC are real people too, and it's always good to be reminded in this toxic world of social media that there are people out there who care about one another.
Imagine a world with less bullying and more self-esteem. When a child has a mentor, their emotional, social, and physical health can increase dramatically. And when we have happy, healthy young people in our communities, everyone benefits. Right now, there are thousands of children waiting for someone to believe in them. Donate or volunteer for Big Brothers Big Sisters. Imagine who they'll become because of you. Visit imaginebbs.ca. Presented with the generous support of Manulife.
There are more ways to connect with us at Voice of BC. Email us at vobc@shaw.ca. Follow us on Twitter at Voice of BC. Or like us on Facebook at facebook.com/VOBC on Shaw TV.
It's interesting after the BC Liberals and their notorious throne speech that was a copy of the NDP platform. I'm noticing in the legislature now that the BC Liberals are actually voting against very many of the things that they claim to support in their own clone speech.
Welcome back to Voice of BC. Lots to talk about and questions on tape. So let's go to Andrew McLeod of the Tyee. Here is Andrew.
Looking at the homelessness crisis and the opioid overdose crisis, you at one point observed that what we are really facing is a social crisis in British Columbia. I'm wondering, when you look back at the track record of your government after 2001, which many observers would say exacerbated that crisis, I'm wondering if you have any regrets.
No, I don't actually. I think we tried our best. I think when you're dealing with people with mental illness and addictions, you try and find ways to do it better. I think in 2005 and 6, when we started to buy older buildings in Vancouver and renovate them, we actually did about 50 buildings for thousands of units that saved that stock for people that would be at risk of homeless or homeless because it was going to be not able to be continued to be lived in. And the thousands of units, and literally thousands of units, probably 10,000 plus units that we built and funded into different things. I think as you come through this, you got to work on more and more models. The opioid crisis was precursor, has come, the crisis that we dealt with initially back in about 2009-10, probably maybe even further back, about 5-6, was crystal meth. And crystal meth, was actually laced into a number of drugs in the drug trade in Vancouver, because we tested a bunch of them back then to find out that a large percentage of crystal meth was in marijuana on the streets and other drugs on the street. Now you have this opioid crisis, which is, quite frankly, North America's, in my opinion, most significant social hit that I've ever seen in my life, going back to when I was a policeman. It is, because it's stunning, the result. This is, you with the crystal meth thing, you had people who develop mental illness. They might go be schizophrenic after a couple of hits of this stuff because it was so bad. This stuff kills people.
Yes.
And I think there's got to be a shift in a couple of directions. The one shift is, I would really like to see Crown Council at some point in time determine that if you're knowingly selling something that kills somebody, the charge isn't possession, it's not trafficking, it's manslaughter. I mean, somebody's gotten killed here. And if you knowingly do that, that's wrong. And I think people are sitting there saying, why aren't we doing more? And at the same time, Terry Lake, who was our health minister, as you know, and during the period of time leading up to the election, this guy is a real humanitarian, and he lost sleep over this. He cared about it. He tried to find the money was given, but then how do you get the results? And you have this insidious drug that can come in small amounts, and it can be hidden so easily, and it can get to your streets. And it's not just our streets; it's every street of every city, pretty much in North America. And the other challenge with this one's different. People always try and point to drugs as being the homeless or the mentally ill or whatever the case may be. But we've had deaths in West Vancouver, in North Vancouver, in the most in upper middle class families. This is a drug that's recreational in areas where people have taken it and died, and they're not in what people have the stereotypical judgmental thing about who happens to take drugs. And it's a challenge, and I don't think anybody worked harder than Terry did. He was certainly recognized for it nationally and internationally, and we've continued to do that, and I would encourage the new government to continue to do that, because it's going to take pulling in the same direction, everybody, and not just politicians. I mean, not just municipal politicians either. I mean, we have to remember that every night somebody might bring someone back to life. Let's say it's a firefighter, an ambulance attendant, a police officer, who all carry the things so they can do it, social workers. There's two traumas. One, you bring somebody back, and sometimes you might lose them. And at the very front end, you've got this very emotional situation for the person that's trying to save the life. And I think I don't have a solution. I do know that we should do more on mental illness, because that's why we integrated stuff into housing, so people could actually get treatment and assistance, and we got better outcomes. But we need to just continue to do this. And I think society's got a big challenge to try and solve this one.
Yeah, you make an interesting point. It's killing people that have no idea what they're taking.
That's correct.
And who've taken a particular drug, whether it was cocaine or something that before, and you have a good or a bad trip on it, but you don't realize that what you're taking is going to kill you because you don't know what's in it.
That's right.
Yeah.
And there are people who actually take it and will continue even after being, because it's such an addictive drug, even after being revived, will go look for their next hit.
Stephanie Smith, the BC Government and Service Employees Union, with a question for Rich Coleman. Here she is.
Hi, Rich. Over the past decade, and especially in the last 5 years, the housing prices in our urban centers have skyrocketed. And this is actually depriving an entire generation of British Columbians the ability to afford to either buy or rent a home that meets their needs. It's particularly affecting working people in our province, and many of them are having to leave. Your government's initiatives did little to nothing to address the affordability of housing in British Columbia. Will you now support the NDP's efforts for affordable housing and taxation that allows British Columbians to buy or rent a home in their own communities?
Well, obviously, I don't totally agree with everything she said.
No, but that's why we put the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of good initiatives in housing in British Columbia. I mean, the home program, which allows people to get money to help with their down payment, to be able to buy a home, is a very important program, and I hope that they continue that. Rent assistance, which is for people under certain that are low-income folks, so they can actually get assistance every month. There's over 40,000 households in BC every month. It's never recognized by anybody, but about 40,000 families, seniors and families, that actually receive assistance every month to offset their rent because they're low income. It's not where we say we're going to build for a group of people and put you all here. You're integrated into the community. It could be a basement suite, could be any type of form of rental, because sometimes you need a different rental depending on the family mix. And I think that's been very successful. And we continue to chase those initiatives. I mean, affordability on ownership is a challenge. It's a supply and demand as much as anything else, plus the foreign ownership hit. Well, we went after that with the tax. It flattened it for a bit, but the growth that we're seeing on the Lower Mainland and the amount of people who are projected to come here, urban planners have to think differently about density and how they can do these things in the future, because quite frankly, most of the Lower Mainland, outside of even the Langleys and Surrey and Chilliwack and all that, that's all agricultural land, and that's not going for housing. Nobody ever wants that to go for housing because that's our source for food. So when you have to say, where are we going to put people if we're going to get this influx of population, you really need to see how your density works and how you can use the land better.
Single-family dwelling is probably a thing of the past in parts of the city?
Well, certainly in the city of Vancouver, but I think it's also becoming a challenge elsewhere, whether it be Abbotsford or Langley or whatever. The housing prices are up because the single-family house is becoming a bit rare as you get infill and that sort of thing because of population growth. At the same time, I know people like my own 2 children who started out with a condo and worked their way up in the market and have a single-family day because they built equity and savings and what have you. So, but it's different, and yet it's, for some people, they often say, well, it's really expensive. And my biggest fear in housing isn't the fear of the housing itself by itself. I mean, it's important to try and get affordability, to get enough product in the market to keep supply and demand in check. But my biggest fear in Canada is actually, as a person that watches the market, is interest rates. Yeah. Because we're highly leveraged, and low interest rates, which you and I both lived through a period of time where people have a hard time believing it, as high as 21% interest. Yep. When I was meeting a payroll in the early 80s, every 2 weeks, right?
I had a 16% mortgage.
Yeah. So, I mean, and then your kids say
$5 a month went to the principal.
Yeah, that's right. That's about right. I mean, my kids say, interest rates might go up to 3.5%. I'm thinking, I never thought I'd see 3.5% interest rates in my lifetime. So there's a lot of factors, always are. I would hope that we could find a way to build more capacity in the market. There's a lot of product in the pipeline, but it takes a long time to get it through the process to get it into actual construction. And I think if you could move a lot of those 100,000 units that are in, particularly on the lower mainland, through the pipeline and get them built, it would help the marketplace.
Bill Tillman with a tough question. Here's Bill.
Mr. Coleman, of all the Liberal leadership candidates, only Todd Stone has suggested that the BC Liberal Party should not take any public funding for elections and operations. That could put a divisive issue in the middle of the Liberal leadership campaign and possibly a huge disadvantage for the Liberals if Mr. Stone is the leader. What are your thoughts on it? Are you concerned? Are you opposed or in favor of taking public funding if the legislation does pass?
Well, we're opposed to it. We're going to bring an amendment to get rid of that section in the legislature when we're in it, and we'll vote against it. Obviously, if the legislation passes, it's a different thing because it's a statutory decision. Anytime you have a leadership race, you have an exchange of ideas, which I have to be prepared for as a leader of the opposition, to know that some days I might go in the House and have quotes from people's debates that are in a leadership campaign thrown back at me relative to questions we might ask in the House. That's a balance, but frankly, it's part of the process. And I think it's good for people to throw their ideas out there and challenge people to thought. And I don't think anybody should be afraid of it. So at the end of the day, the decision will be made by the BC Liberal Party if the legislation actually ever passes. I mean, the fact of the matter is we're not going to just let this slide by. We're going to oppose it.
The legislation, if it passes, would provide the Liberal Party with a check based on the votes in the recent election, and it would come in 2 installments, January the 1st and July 1st, and it would be about $1 million each check. So the NDP would get about the same because they got about the same number of votes. And I forget the number for the Greens, but it's
about
not
800,000.
Yeah. So you'd get a check. The party headquarters would get a check for $1 million in January. The leadership race won't be over at that point.
No.
So what do? I guess they just wait for the leader to see what they want to do.
Well, I think they have to operate as the BC Liberal Party executive and make the decisions for the party. Yeah. I mean, that's not something we elect a president and an executive, and their job is to do that work.
Yeah.
I don't
down
like
a lot
it.
of money.
Oh yeah, but I don't like it. I think I don't like it at all because I don't believe that any more than anybody else. But I don't believe my NDP friends should have their tax dollars go to my campaign if they want to give it to an NDP candidate in my riding, because it really takes out the fact that you're supposed to build your base of people that want to support you. The other part I don't like about it is it really excludes everybody else. So you really have 3 parties because they chose the threshold so 3 parties would get the $250 per vote that they got, but all the other parties are excluded. And so I think it's a move to solidify the 3-party system in BC, and I don't think that's right either.
Yeah, you're right. The Conservative Party, if they reactivate themselves, which they haven't done, or any independent wouldn't be in line for this, because it's based on how many votes you got in the last election, and there's a threshold. So you don't.
And I've always raised my most of my money from people that have supported me for 20 years.
This is an interesting question from Jeff Bray. This is shaping up as a big political battle next year, and I'm already hearing some of the candidates for the Liberal leadership saying this is something the party has really got to work next year on and fight. This is the referendum, and here is Jeff with a question on it.
The government recently introduced legislation that, among other things, calls for a referendum on electoral reform to be by mail-in ballot as opposed to in conjunction with another event such as the municipal election. And I'm wondering if Mr. Coleman can comment on behalf of the opposition on that particular aspect and whether or not they have concerns about that process.
Well, we have concerns, and my biggest concern is that's not what was promised. First of all, the promise was a yes or no question. It appears in the legislation they're going to move to try and have 3 options and 3 questions. That's not what was promised by the NDP with regards to electoral reform. The second piece is they're not going to use the Referendum Act. They're going to go to 50% plus 1. And the way they're doing it, it basically means that the city of Vancouver, Langley, Burnaby, and Victoria can decide how everybody else in the province is going to elect their people in the future, because they will have more votes down there, and be able to actually basically subvert the wishes of the people in the Okanagan, the Kootenay, the Northern Interior, the North Coast areas, because the smaller communities, less population. So these people down here will make the decision for everybody, and I think that's completely wrong.
Do you think it's something that the party will be able to fight next year? I mean, I've heard a lot of the leadership candidates saying this has got to be a priority.
It won't just be the BC Liberals. I mean, I think you'll see a coalition of people, including probably people like Bill Thielman.
He ran the last one. He's getting ready for this one.
Come together and work on the no side with regards to this referendum. And I think it won't just be a political party. I think it'll be all of us that don't believe this is the way to go for British Columbia out there campaigning, probably very much working together across political lines to make sure that the people of British Columbia totally understand what this means for them and their future, and to make sure people understand that this is playing with the fact that they're going to lose their representation if this were to go ahead, and we need to stop it.
One more question before the break. Tom Fletcher, president of the Press Gallery. Here he is.
Rich, we've seen the stats. Metro Vancouver homeless count. The numbers are up 40% since 2011. And this is with all the street outreach and all the hundreds of millions of dollars spent on single room occupancy and all of the rest of it that you presided over. It seems like the more services are provided, the more people come to BC to use those services. If you build it, they will come. We have demonstrated that now. What do you do next?
Hope that the other economies across the country improve, to start with. I think we saw a significant influx. I mean, we were actually bending the curve. I mean, even the mayor of Vancouver, if he's being honest, we're bending the curve the other way there for a few years. We're actually had homelessness going down. And then we saw a significant influx into the province, particularly from Ontario and Alberta. We're Canadians. People are welcome anywhere in our country, so if they come here to seek services, we need to take care of them just like any other jurisdiction. I get criticized for that type of thinking from many people who think for some reason we should not allow that to happen. But at the same time, the experience we had, particularly even with the one at the courthouse in Victoria, which we ended up housing the people and working very hard to solve that issue, it was an influx. The largest percentage of people that were in that camp were not from British Columbia, and they'd come here looking for an opportunity. And you will see it on social pressures. You'll often see economy versus non-economy in different jurisdictions. You'll see migration within countries and within jurisdictions, and I think that's what we're seeing. And I think we just have to stay focused on it. I mean, it really is about once you stabilize people and you can actually stabilize them into housing with support, you can actually help them turn their lives around. And if you turn around one life, it's worth the investment in that individual to try and give them a better future, as far as I'm concerned.
Take a brief break on Voice of BC with Rich Coleman, back with one more segment. Stay with us.
A lot of people are calling Rich Coleman the interim leader, but legally, constitutionally, he is the leader of the BC Liberal Caucus, He's the leader of Her Majesty's opposition. He has the full powers to determine the course of the party, to reward caucus members and hire staff, and to discipline people and fire people as needed. However, he's got a delicate balance because he knows in February he's going to be giving that position up to somebody else. He has to hold the government to account. He has to build the party, but he can't tie the hands of next year's leader in terms of policy, in terms of staff, or any direction. It's a difficult balance, probably harder than it looks. If he does it well, BC Liberals will thank him for years to come.
You fill up my senses, come fill me again.
Rich Coleman wasn't a supporter of Christy Clark when she ran for the leadership of the BC Liberal Party, but he soon became her top lieutenant. I have to wonder how good he feels, or bad he feels, that Christy Clark had to resign both as leader and as premier.
Well, we're back on Voice of BC, and I think you can probably guess how Rich Coleman feels about how things have gone this year. This probably wasn't his career plan in politics for 2017. It's an interesting question. Doug King, here he is, Douglas King.
Since forming government, the NDP has implemented an increase to income assistance rates, restoration of the provincial bus pass program, the implementation of a provincial poverty reduction strategy, and other measures like increases to legal aid, which will reduce and alleviate poverty. If your government takes power, will you agree with these measures, or will you seek to rescind them?
Oh, I think we've all agreed that over time we want to raise social assistance rates. People forget that, and I hate to go back to the decade of the 90s, they didn't raise them. And we actually raised the shelter rate at one point, and we tried to adapt the system to be more proactive for people to get to school, like the single parents initiative, to get people to go back to university, take care of their daycare, take care of their education costs, help them find a job, and stabilize them and continue to pay them benefits even for a year after. Those are the type of initiatives you need to continue and build on. So I don't think anybody has any argument with the fact that you need to continue to try and build programs that lift people up out of poverty. And while you're doing that, trying to make sure that they have the opportunities that they need.
For a half dozen years, while Rich Coleman appeared on this show, we were always talking about the next topic that's coming up. Bruce Halser is going to raise it. Here's Bruce.
As a cabinet minister, you were the major champion and promoter of LNG in British Columbia. As you know, since the election of this government, whether it's because of market forces or political forces or both, it doesn't look like we're going to have any big LNG plants in British Columbia in the next few years. Do you still believe this industry is part of BC's future? And if so, when will it be, and what has to happen to make it so?
I do still believe in LNG big time. I know that as the decision was being made on the Pacific Northwest LNG plant, there was a real nervousness internationally about the size of the investment coming into a jurisdiction that really wanted to shut it down. I mean, that was the letter the Premier wrote as an opposition leader to the federal environmental people to say, we don't support this, we want you to stop it now, don't approve it, even though they went through all the processes for 4 years to get their permit. And then when you know that you need to make a change to your permit and you have a government that's saying, well, we're opposed to your project, and you're deciding to make another $5-10 billion investment, you step back and say, maybe this isn't now and this isn't the place right now. I still think you'll see a major LNG plant in British Columbia. There's still companies out there working towards it. LNG Canada is certainly continue on with its work.
The Shell is sort of the big one that's...
Yeah, that's LNG Canada. And, you know, we have the resource. The resource is unbelievable in the northeast part of the province. Even the government of Qatar told me they think our resource may be better than theirs, and they're one of the biggest LNG players in the world. We have liquids with our LNG, so there's a bit of pretty clean-looking oil. There's propane, there's butane. That actually helps to offset the cost of the product. It's getting it to Tidewater, which is the big expense, is the pipeline piece. I think a lot of work was done with First Nations who have actually supported right across the north to support LNG pipelines and pipeline benefit agreements, environmental monitoring that they want to do. And I think people forget that the LNG wasn't just about moving the resource, but it was seen by the First Nations up there who became friends of mine and still is. And they're hoping, because they see it as the opportunity to lift their communities out of poverty, to train their young people for jobs, because training was going on for them, and they've already seen some of their young people in jobs at other things like the propane plant that's gone into Rupert. And you know, we forget about that down here because we see First Nations who are very successful on their lands because they're close to major population areas and they can do development and these things. That opportunity doesn't exist in the north. And I think LNG is as important for First Nations as any piece of it, because if you go into a small First Nation community by an hour and a half gravel road out of a community and you sit and visit with them, you see the standard of housing and the standard of opportunity and the unemployment rate, you say, we really need to push this opportunity, not just for the fact that we can move a resource to offset carbon somewhere else in the world, not just because we have a resource that we should be doing, but at the same time, we give First Nations the opportunities that they deserve with regards to their economic future.
In less than a month, the new Democratic Party government of British Columbia will settle in around the cabinet table and make a decision, which I think will define to some degree what kind of a government we're going to have in British Columbia and where they're headed with things. It's a huge decision. It's not an easy one, in my view, but some people might think it's an easy one to make. With a question about it from Political Science Department at the University of Victoria, Jamie Lawson. Here he is.
I'd like to ask you something about the Site C Dam and the recent decision on the part of the NDP to delay its progress in order to review its economic case. Now, I'm sure you don't think that's a great idea, but looking back, was it such a great idea to try to push the project past the point of no return leading up to the elections? Because after all, you couldn't guarantee to British Columbians that you were going to win those elections.
So what do you think of this?
Well, if you built the future of a province on a 4-year electoral cycle rather than what is right for the next generation, you wouldn't do what that individual said. But I was minister responsible for hydro for a period of time. I believe in the Site C Dam. I know the work that went into it, the research that went into it, the 30 years of work, quite frankly, that went into it. And at the same time, I look at someone like the leader of the Green Party, who, when he was on the climate action thing with us back when we did the carbon tax and the climate action thing, said Site C was the right project to do, who now says it isn't. I mean, I don't know if it's a political move or whatever on that individual's point, but the fact of the matter is, Canada's saying to us, the world's saying to us, reduce your carbon footprint. So if you want to reduce the carbon footprint in the Northeast where the oil and gas is, the easiest way is to electrify it. So you put electricity in there rather than running the pumps on fossil fuel, you run it on electricity. You run the plants, you run the pipeline, the pressure, all of that. We could reduce massive amounts of GHGs just by doing that. And Site C would allow you to do that. Then you hear people say, well, you need to have wind and you need to have solar. If you don't have a battery to back it up, it's pretty much useless power, because when the wind blows, you can store some of it, but eventually you have to back it up. The wind's not blowing or the sun isn't shining. And that's what a dam does for you. It's like a big battery that allows you to have other alternative energies to even clean up your environment even more. And BC is viewed to be one of the cleanest jurisdictions in the world for electricity simply because of hydroelectric power, which is accepted as clean power worldwide. And, so you have an opportunity to do the last dam on the piece, which is always in the plan, to actually have the future power in a place where you can actually look at how we can manage it in the future, recognizing that there's going to be different pressures on electricity in the future. Some people think our usage will go down. I don't believe that's the case, because we're going to have growth. 1 million people come to BC over the next 20 years. You have the advent of electric vehicles and those things that will also take more and more power. And you need to be ready. And you can't be ready if you think we're not going to make a decision because there might be an election 2 years from now. The work was completed. The project was ready. The research was done. The design was done. And it was time for a cabinet to make a decision and approved it, and we made it.
You've faced John Horgan across the floor of the House. He was your critic at times. You know that on some occasions in the past he actually supported Site C.
That's
said
correct.
It was a good idea. Give me your read. What will be the call of the NDP cabinet when they settle in November the 1st? They've got the whole month, probably make a decision by the end of the year. 3 options: kill it, suspend operations, or let her go. What do you think they'll do?
I hope they make the right decision.
Which would be let her go.
Which would be to let it get built. I mean, it's already got a few $1 billion into it. It will be a legacy project that they could be proud of. If they look over their shoulders as they make that decision, they'll know that they made the decision for the future of people of British Columbia for all the right reasons. This should not be a political decision, that we've decided we don't like it just because somebody else built it. If that was the case, British Columbia wouldn't be built, because the highways would have been political all the way along, the hospitals and all of those things that had to be built for the future of our citizens. It's important for governments to think further than today. And I believe this is an example of thinking further than today.
We got time for a few more questions. Let's go to Tealman again. Oh, this is a good one, too. Bill Tealman.
Mr. Coleman, Todd Stone, when he was Transportation Minister in the BC Liberal government, promised around 2013 to do a complete review of tolling policy to do with bridges, etc. That never happened. Tolling became a major political issue, and your party lost when the NDP said they'd get rid of tolls on the Port Mann and Golden Ears. What's your view of tolling now, and do you regret that that review never took place?
I think our first tolling review was when we did the Port Mann, and we decided there had to be an alternative route. It was actually with the Golden Ears way back when, people forget. And it was really about there had to be an alternative to the bridge if you're going to have a tolled bridge, so people could have and we made our decision on the Port Mann that way too. I think people should recognize one thing, that infrastructure costs money. A lot of people think the user should pay. So in the case of the Port Mann, it was an expensive project. It solved a significant bottleneck. It was moving huge amounts of goods and services now, way better. Now it's starting to receive the gridlock, and I've noticed it because I use it a lot. But at the same time, what's going to happen, I believe, is that they're just going to find another way. So they're going to raise the they're going to raise the carbon tax on April the 1st. That should affect the people in the interior by about 7 cents a litre for their gasoline to pay for taking the tolls off the Port Mann and the Golden Ears. I don't know that there's somebody in Pouce Coupe or a rancher in Williams Lake that has to go miles to go back and forth to his properties with his cattle and what have you, is going to appreciate paying more for gas for somebody else's bridge. I also believe that the backdoor thing here that will come from the NDP will be road pricing. So people who are on the lower mainland who don't have access to transit will be penalized because they have to drive further because they can't actually get there by jumping on a SkyTrain or jumping on a bus that doesn't, because it's not close to where they live. And I think that's the next huge argument here. Or huge discussion. I think we can't kid ourselves that you have to that anything's a free good. We actually have to find a way to take the responsibilities of the generation, pay for the infrastructure that we need today, so we don't leave it on the backs of our kids.
One of the many reviews being conducted by the new government, we counted them up the other day, I think it was about 24 of one kind or another, review and consultation and all that, which is fine, they're a new government. One of them, however, here's a question about it. Richard Truscott.
The governing parties have proposed to increase the minimum wage up to $15, and there's a commission now set up to look at exactly how to do that. How would your party, if you were returned to government, how would your party deal with the $15 minimum wage? Would it roll it back? Would it freeze it? Would it increase it further? What are your plans, your party's plans for the minimum wage moving forward?
Well, this for them is on the Never Never plan. It's about 4 years out. They took great pride in raising the minimum wage in September, which was already in the plan by our government to incrementally over a period of years bring the minimum wage up. So they've taken pride in doing that. And if you work with business, which you should, because what happens if a business is being pushed too much to the wall for their costs, they will, and small business in particular, who create a lot of jobs, but they do it on the back of their own risk and their own chances that they're taking to actually build that business. They need to have certainty and timing. So the first thing is, how will you incrementally do this? They're going to do this Fair Wage Commission or whatever they're calling it, and they say they want to get to $15 an hour. The important thing is to make sure you consult with the businesses to understand how that works, how that affects their ability to hire, how it affects their ability to train, and the most important piece of this is who will they hire. If the standard practice seems to be that if you're taking a risk at the front end of training an employee, you want to have some of that risk borne by the fact that you're going to have mistakes that are going to cost you from the employee as you train them. And that's a given, and that's fine in business. And I think they can manage that risk as long as they have the relationship with the government that says, let's do this in an incremental way together so we understand how it will impact on jobs and the economy going forward. That's the important piece. I don't think anybody argues about the fact that you shouldn't try and move a minimum wage, which basically is just a bottom bellwether, and most people are not being paid the minimum wage in BC today. The average wage in BC is about $21 an hour today. It's really about, giving people certainty when they're making an investment, if they're going to invest in business, as to how that will look going forward.
Jeff Bray was only a member of the BC legislature for about 4 years, but he spotted something in one of the pieces of legislation recently that he framed as an intriguing question. I hadn't thought of this till I saw his question. Here's Jeff.
Recently, the government introduced legislation that, among other things, changes the level for party status for BC parties in the House from 4 down to 2. I'm wondering whether or not this causes the opposition concern that at any given point in time, 2 members from any party who are not happy with their current situation could break away and yet form another party in the House.
And if they were recognized as a party, this is the part that I hadn't thought of. The 2 people break away, they're recognized as a party, take a party name on. They then get a leader's salary, which is a boost of $25,000 a year. And the other member, guy, gal, gets $15,000, $12,000, something like that, for the party whip or caucus chair or something like that. Is this, we've gone from 4 down to 2. The Greens are 3. That's why we're changing the number. But is this an opening for more parties in the House?
It's a good question, actually. We've talked about it, but I think, first of all, we should...
The Rich Coleman party with 1 other member, right? This is an opening, an opportunity.
Don't open that up. You know what it is? We thought it should be 3. Yeah. So we'll probably look at an amendment to 3 because it's 3 parties, and you would basically say, okay, you have a House leader, a leader, and obviously a caucus chair whip type position. I think 2 is a little low. I think 3 we should go to. I think I've said it before. I think when we didn't move to 2 or to recognize the 2 people in 2001 to 2005, Joy and Jenny, I always felt that we should have done something different. But we learned by our mistakes. I think that's why we had to be on this one. I think there's more concern in that piece of legislation about that piece, about the official party status, versus the change of the election time, because this legislation allows whoever's government, the NDP today, theoretically, to go 4.5 years. We've always believed if you're going to change it to the fall, you should take it to 3.5 years. So actually, if you want to change the fixed election date, don't give yourself a benefit of another 6 months in office, because that looks like you're taking care of yourself. So we'll debate that too. We'll have some amendments for the bill, and if 4 people were unhappy today, they could go form their own party. So although Jeff is making an observation, it just doesn't seem to happen because people get to know each other. They work together as a team, and they run together, and they usually stick together.
The New Democrats seem to think that the Liberals are going to throw in the towel and let them adjourn the House before the Remembrance Day holiday, November the 11th. The House is down to sit right to the end of November 30th. Have you figured that out yet? Are you going to let them get away easily and early?
Well, we're not getting away. Nobody's getting away easily. There's not a lot of legislation in front of the House. So it's all about how much time it takes, right? Mm-hmm. So we have significant issues in around the proportional representation, amendments we want to do, debates we want to have, which, it'll depend, right? And is there any other legislation coming that would change the timeline? We have to work out the schedule for all the estimate debates and all the ministers. So at this stage, I wouldn't give you a yay or nay. And frankly, even if I had an idea, I wouldn't give up my strategy
fair enough.
To the other side of the house.
Well, on that note, we'll end then. So you're not going to tell me. Thank you very much, Rich Coleman, for being on the show tonight. It's good. Thank you for watching Voice of BC, bringing the legislature, BC politics into your living room. Good night.